looks like we're filling in the few seats left up front. There's a few on the side here that people could fill. Thank you all so much for coming. We're very excited to kick off this colloquium on the promise of fair housing, developments in planning, law, and civil rights. As many of you who are DUS students have heard me say before, one of the defining characteristics of U.S. metropolitan areas is the continuing high levels of residential segregation on the basis of race and increasing levels of segregation on the basis of income. Over the past several years, we've seen increasing evidence of the tremendous impact that this segregated metropolitan structure has on access to opportunity and on socioeconomic mobility. And I'd argue that we also see evidence of, or products of, this segregation in the news every day, in shaping the policing practices that, and the violence against, police violence against black men in particular, and black women as well, that Black Lives Matter has brought to public attention, in the news about lead poisoning in Flint, Michigan, or in lead poisoned soil in public housing in East Chicago, Indiana, and in the Boston area in unequal school performance and gentrification, and municipal fragmentation. The past 2 years have actually been particularly interesting years for issues of segregation and fair housing. Last summer, the Supreme Court decided a case called the Texas Department of Housing and Community Affairs versus the Inclusive Communities Project, which was a suit about where low-income housing tax credit properties were built and why they were more likely to be approved in low-income, predominantly minority neighborhoods. And the main issue in that case was the Supreme Court affirming that you can still bring a suit under the Fair Housing Act on the basis of the discriminatory effect that a policy has, regardless of the intent of the policymakers. Also last summer, HUD, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, issued the long-awaited affirmatively furthering fair housing rule, which is a big focus of the coming talks, regarding what is required of recipients of federal housing and community development funding in taking concrete affirmative steps to address disparities in access to opportunity and to further fair housing. The rule obligates HUD for the first time to provide municipalities and the public with data about patterns of segregation and disparities in access to high-performing schools, transportation, and environmental hazards. It also requires municipalities receiving HUD funds to engage in a more rigorous analysis of the local impediments to fair housing and articulate steps that they will take to overcome those obstacles. So there's much discussion about these issues in the housing and community development worlds right now, but not yet clear answers. Will the rule make any difference for the low-income households who are seeking affordable housing in high-opportunity neighborhoods? Will it lead to any changes in the striking disparities that we see across neighborhoods and municipalities? And what will it mean for those municipalities and for community developers? And we're very excited to have with us here, and hopefully at future sessions, people from the housing and community development community in the region, from the Cambridge Housing Authority, from CHAPA, from the National Fair Housing Alliance. So this is a great opportunity to bring DUS together with our region and our country. These are some questions we hope this series of discussions can start to answer. Today we have Lee Fennell and Bill Fischel, who I'll introduce momentarily. This coming Friday we have Raphael Bostic, the former I think Undersecretary for Policy Development and Research at HUD, who's speaking together with Jeff Lubell from Aft Associates. Next week we have Professor Ed Getz coming from Minnesota with David Harris, the founder of the Fair Housing Center of Greater Boston, and then Vicki Bean from the New York City Department of Housing Preservation and Development in the first Tuesday in October, together with Janine Anzalota from the Boston Mayor's Office of Fair Housing and Equity. And that's just the initial ones. There's more coming after that too. So before I introduce our speakers, I want to say a very few quick thanks. First of all, to Iran and to the Bemis funding from the department to make this series possible. So thank you very much, Iran and the department. Second thanks to Larry Vail and Ingrid Gould-Ellen, who have helped co-create this series. So thank you, Larry and Ingrid. Also to several master students who have been really helpful in the nuts and bolts of all of this, Will Monson, Carmen Chung, and Jesse Hennigan. Thank you. And also finally to Nick Kelly, the PhD student, who has been absolutely instrumental in imagining this series and in making it happen. So thank you to all of those folks. So without going any longer, let's get started. Lee Fennell is a professor at the University of Chicago Law School and the co-director of the University of Chicago's Kreisman Initiative on Housing Law and Policy. Looking at her educational background, I understand better why I love her legal writing so much. She's probably my favorite legal writer to read because we care about such similar issues. But I realized also that she has a degree in public administration, similar to a lot of the things that we do here, and a degree in creative writing as well as law. So that makes one of the reasons why her writing is so readable. She's the editor of Fairness in Law and Economics, and a forthcoming volume on evidence and innovation in housing law and policy, which I think Ingrid and Bill also have chapters in. And she is the author of The Unbounded Home, Property Values Beyond Property Lines, and the forthcoming, I love this title, Slices and Lumps, Division and Aggregation in Law and Life. She's one of the nation's leading scholars on property and land use law, and has a list of publications that goes on much longer, but we're honored to have her here. And we're also honored to have Bill Fischel here from the Department of Economics at Dartmouth. He'll respond after Lee speaks for about 10 minutes before we open for questions. He's one of the leading economic theorists of local government and land use, and the author most recently of the home voter hypothesis, and then last year, actually most recently, Zoning Rules, the Economics of Land Use Regulation, among a list of other groundbreaking books. So this is a dream team of property and land use scholars, and we're very excited to have them here. Please join me in welcoming Lee Fennell.
Thanks so much, Justin. I'm really honored to be here and to be part of this great series. Hearing the list of people who are yet to come, I hope I can live up to being in the series. But I'm very interested and excited to hear all of your feedback on this paper because it's still at a stage where I'm working on it and revising it, and in fact this is the first time I've actually presented it, so I'll be curious to get your reactions. And it focuses on the role of search practices, how those contribute to or impede the project of fair housing. This title slide is meant to be sort of like a searchlight or something like that. I'm not sure if it comes through, but at any rate, it sort of starts with this sort of opening puzzle, which is that racial discrimination occurs kind of on both sides of the line here in the middle. There's racial discrimination, has been historically racial discrimination against people who are looking for homes, and that's been illegal in the United States, everywhere in the United States since 1968. The Fair Housing Act was passed that year. That same year, there was a Supreme Court decision that held that actually a law that had been on the books since 1866 also forbade private discrimination in property transactions. And there's pretty broad normative consensus, not necessarily with respect to every detail of the Fair Housing Act or every detail of anti-discrimination law, but there's generally broad normative consensus about prohibitions on discrimination that take the form of intentionally discriminating against people who are looking for a home, turning them away because of their race or because of their other protected characteristics. On the other hand, on the other side of the line, home seekers, people who are looking for homes, also discriminate, also engage in forms of racial discrimination frequently, both through choosing areas where they're searching based on racial composition, perhaps based on even racial discrimination against those who are the individuals who are selling or renting out homes. But racial discrimination by home seekers has never really been reached as a legal or policy matter. It's typically presumed to be perfectly legal. It's kind of uncanny. I read several articles sort of talking about this issue, and they all seem to use the words perfectly legal. That it's just perfectly legal to go and choose a home and explicitly employ racial criteria in doing that. And it's also widely viewed as normatively unreachable, something that we don't really think the law reaches, and we don't really think that it should reach. And I don't at all mean to suggest that everyone, that all housing policy people are like completely comfortable with the idea that people are using kind of racial criteria when they determine where to live. Rather,
Sorry, I just can't hear you in the back.
Okay, good. See if I can figure out how to do this. I'm just going to do it. Okay, is that better? Better? Worse? No different? Do I need to turn it a different way? Okay, is that better? Okay, all right. So you have no idea what I said? Yeah. Okay, great, fantastic. This first slide still, I think it's somewhat self-explanatory. We have this problem of racial discrimination by home seekers. I don't want to at all suggest that everyone is complacent or thinks it's great or anything like that. I think many people are deeply troubled by it, but there's a general consensus that it's not something that the law has any role in doing anything about, and it's not something that the law currently reaches. And there are a couple of reasons, I think, that it's viewed as normatively being unreachable. And one has to do with kind of a presumption that maybe this isn't especially harmful. We're just talking about consumer decisions after all, just individual people who are going out and looking for homes, navigating choices like anyone else. And so I think there may be a sense that it's not especially harmful, also a sense that it would be very intrusive to try to control it in any way, or to try to tell people, to try to make it be the law's business in some sense, how families go to choose a home. Okay, and so I think that both of those sentiments are out there, and this project is a little bit of a counter to that, and suggesting both that I do think there's at least aspects of housing search that should and can be reached both as a normative matter and doctrinally, that the law does allow tools for reaching at least some aspects of how people go about searching for homes. So that's what this project is designed to look at. And sort of starting with the question of whether it is harmful at all, whether there's anything about the way that people search for homes that creates problems for housing. Well, I think that there is a clear sense in which this is the case, and we can kind of go back theoretically to Tom Schelling, who had these very interesting models that many of you may have studied, looking at how dynamics of decision-making can interact. And what he did, and this is a screenshot from a computer simulation that was developed based on his ideas, and they have various versions of these online, and you can sort of endlessly play with them and plug in different things and watch the colors swim around. It's sort of interesting, but when he was actually working on it initially in the 60s, he used just like checkerboard and like dimes and nickels or something like that to try to test out these dynamics. And what he found is that even if people have relatively mild preferences, they do have preferences about their neighbors, and they act on those preferences, that it can lead to segregated patterns. And in his model, it's all about what people are choosing, where they're choosing to move to and where they're choosing to move from. There's nobody in the Schelling model that's telling someone they can't move to a square. There's no exclusion, there's no discrimination by someone who is blocking their access, but all the same, all these individual choices end up potentially creating a lot of harm in terms of perpetuating segregation. And so similarly, the individual choices of home seekers can aggregate in a way that creates a lot of problems and contribute to both to entrenching and perpetuating segregation and to some other dynamics that are problematic. So probably the largest mechanism, of course, is that if you already have areas that are very segregated, and we can talk in more detail about sort of what's been happening with segregation trends, but if you already have areas that are relatively segregated, and you have people that are making choices that are kind of based on racial composition, that tend to kind of reinforce those same segregated patterns, you end up having this become more and more entrenched, and it impedes integration efforts. It also can really skew housing markets. If you have, especially the phenomenon I focus on in the paper is what Ingrid Ellen has referred to as white avoidance. If you have white home seekers that are avoiding African American communities, it can lead to the dynamic that we've seen, which is that there's a lot less housing appreciation in African American neighborhoods. And that can perpetuate wealth disparities because you don't have as many people bidding in those areas. It also can be a way of facilitating discrimination by housing providers. If you know that a lot of the folks out there who are housing consumers have these biases, then that creates some pressures towards housing providers, somebody who's developing housing, towards doing things subtly or ways that they can get by under the radar that will tend to shape their market in a way that will be segregative. And in addition, even at the level of home seekers who put maybe self-describing ads on the internet, and which is something that's also been deemed to be perfectly legal, describing their own protected characteristics, that enables a landlord to select them without having to ever place an ad themselves. So it can certainly contribute to even the kind of discrimination that everyone kind of normatively agrees is problematic and actionable. Okay, so why focus on search and why focus on it now? Well, the phenomenon of white avoidance remains a primary driver of segregation. White flight or exit from neighborhoods has ebbed in recent decades, and now the primary way in which housing choice generates segregation, perpetuates it, is through this dynamic of avoidance. And so it seems as if it's an important time to look now, because as Justin was mentioning, this is a time when integration is really getting a renewed look. Inclusive communities, the case that Justin was mentioning, it upheld the disparate impact cause of action, but it also did something else that I think was very interesting and in some ways maybe surprising to some onlookers. Maybe they weren't expecting this to happen to the degree it did, but Justice Kennedy actually reiterated that integration is a goal of the Fair Housing Act. And with integration as a goal, and with the new affirmatively further fair housing rule from HUD, looking at ways to try to break down patterns of entrenched segregation, there's a renewed focus on how to do this. Well, it seems like we should be looking at both sides of the equation, not just looking at the ways that people get blocked out, but the ways that choices end up perpetuating these dynamics. The other thing a couple other things that are important here. One is that the changes in the nature of how people do searches make it especially interesting to try to address this now. It's become increasingly the case that people are kind of directly engaged in their own housing searches, not having to do it all through realtors, and certainly doing it in new ways using apps and so on. We'll talk about some specifics on that, but it is becoming maybe more important to be able to address kind of the way that search is changing, and also maybe more feasible to address it in certain ways by saying, well, what kinds of apps should be the ones that become focal for people when they're going to pick where to live? Should it be one where there's a simple drop-down menu where you can filter by racial composition, or should it not be that? And then, of course, especially interesting to me, from the scholarship perspective, is this is an area that's really been ignored by legal scholars. Largely dismissed, largely not even looked at all. And to the extent it's discussed, it's kind of assumed, well, you just kind of have to forget about that domain of people looking for housing. That's just not something we can or should really do anything about. It treats it as kind of both doctrinally and normatively not something that can be a useful lever. There's, however, been some recent related work that has started to kind of question in some areas that are kind of cognate areas in some ways. There's been some recent work on discrimination by customers in other areas. So, you know, discrimination against Uber drivers, you know, discrimination in all kinds of settings where customers are making choices that might end up having racially discriminatory effects, or be just outright racially have a racially discriminatory intent. And whether there's any way to reach that is actually a really interesting question that scholars are starting to look at, not so much in housing, but in some other areas. And Liz Emmons, several years ago, had a paper where she actually looked at intimate discrimination. So discrimination along protected lines in choosing who you're going to date, for example, or who you're going to live with, who you're going to marry. And she doesn't suggest that this should be something the state should control, but she does suggest that there are some ways in which it might not be completely, you know, beyond the scope of what we would think about as legal scholars. And so similarly, I think this is something that really deserves a focus. Okay, so there's a lot of other things that this paper doesn't look directly at in terms of trying to maintain its focus on search. But I'll be glad to try to talk about those in question and answer. There's also several things that relate to this claim I'm making that housing, the way that consumers choose to go about their housing search generates harm. So here's a few questions people might be starting to wonder about in the audience, and I'm not going to totally answer all these now, but I do have some like bonus slides if you like ask the right questions that I could maybe pop up some slides and like try to find them on here if I can successfully master the technology. So I guess to sort of sum up my response to these questions, there is some diminution in segregation, some downward trends, but there still is really remarkable persistence of it, especially in certain urban areas. And it remains, as Justin was mentioning, a real driver of inequities. There is, of course, concern about not just about things like white avoidance, but also about white invasion, gentrification. And I think there's an argument to be made here that a lot of the dynamics that we see, to the extent they prove to be destructive, are actually kind of driven in some ways by race-based decision-making as well. I'll be glad to say more on that. There's also other factors, of course, that contribute to the fact that there's still segregation. There's income and wealth disparities, but there's really good evidence that those are not enough on their own to actually explain the patterns that we see. And there's been some recent coverage on this in the papers and in research about the fact that African Americans are so much more likely to live in low-income, high-poverty neighborhoods, even if they're relatively high income. And so it's not all about income and wealth disparities by any means. We'd have a vastly less segregated society if we were to have just sort of sorting based on income and wealth. And then there is also a question of, maybe there's still discrimination, right? I mean, we don't catch everything, and so that certainly is the case, although it seems as if at least the most overt forms are diminishing. And then there's sort of questions about, preferences. Is what we're seeing mutually preferred sorting that shouldn't be the law's business? Well, this kind of gets to a lot of difficult questions about home seeker racial preferences and to what extent those are asymmetric. So part of the claim of the paper is that there are asymmetrically strong sort of white avoidance kinds of preferences when we're talking about what's driving black-white segregation. And that although there may be some same-race preferences by African American households as well, those are not as strong, and in some ways are understood to be contingent in part on both the choices that exist in a really highly segregated society and the discrimination that's been kind of the backdrop for all of this. Okay, so but how do we really know what people are thinking about racial preferences? Well, we can ask them, and for a long time this is sort of the standard methodology, this sort of show card methodology, where you sort of say, if you live here, would you move in if this many of your neighbors were white or African American? This card here, I think, is one actually used to measure African American preferences, and sort of record what people say. This, I think, has probably become a less reliable method, especially at testing preferences of whites. People have become increasingly reluctant to be honest on dimensions. It's unclear whether people are going to, in any survey where you ask people to self-report how good of responses you'll get. But in the sort of evidence that exists, there certainly was strong evidence for the asymmetry I was just referring to. And there's also evidence that the decision of whether to move into a neighborhood is a much stronger, much more based on racial composition, much more strongly than a decision even to move out. Okay, so there's various reasons why that might be the case. The other thing that you can do, of course, is you can just watch what people do. You can see where people move. You can try to figure out why, sort of reveal preferences. You can also ask people a little bit more sneakily about, and one good study on this, a couple of different versions of this study approach, calls people and asks them to imagine that they're in the market for a home and ask how likely it is that they would buy a particular home, and they're kind of get randomly generated information about a bunch of different dimensions that people would normally care about in choosing a home. Like what's the crime rate like, what's the education system like, and in there they also are told racial composition. Right, and so then once all this information is disaggregated, it becomes evident that the racial composition does some independent work above and beyond all these other factors. And it's unclear why that is, right? It could be that people are saying, well, now that I know the racial composition, I'm going to not really believe you when you said the school system was good, or I'm going to not really believe you when you said the crime rate was low. I'm going to adjust it in my mind. It's a little unclear what's going on, but it's another way to try to get at this. There's also been some work done on sort of video vignettes, showing people pictures of neighborhoods and having them rate the neighborhoods. Maria Kreisen and co-authors did one study where they showed people little video segments that had, these are just some still shots from them, it showed people different neighborhoods. And they would show the exact same neighborhood with different people depicted in it. Right? And so sometimes it would show white people, sometimes it would show black people, sometimes it would show white and black people in the neighborhood. And white respondents in particular would rate the neighborhood lower if it had black people in it than if it only had white people in it. So this is kind of evidence of some kind of at least implicit bias. People are looking at the same thing happening. People are working on a car in the driveway, or they're walking down the street with groceries, or whatever it is, and people are responding responding differently. So there's some evidence there. There's another study that was done that tried to look at how highly people would rate a house that was for sale, and in one case they had it be the sellers were a black family. In another case, it was a white family. They had the same name in both scenarios. They were sort of similarly configured, similarly attired, and the house was the same, and it was rated less favorably. It was a relatively small study, so again, you can always sort of question the results, but it suggested that there were lower ratings for the house when the black family was the seller. Okay, so we have some evidence out there that there's something to this idea of bias among home seekers, and the question is kind of, what can or should the law do about it? Another issue that often kind of comes up in this discussion is whether when people are using race to determine where to live, to the extent they are they using it as a proxy, right? Are they using it as a proxy for something that we think is kind of a legitimate thing for them to care about, like how good will the services be? Will there be a lot of crime in the neighborhood? Will the schools be good? Right? And there's a few different lines of argument that kind of come from this line of thought. One of them is about culpability, like, well, maybe should we blame people that much if this is what they're really after? Well, actually we do usually blame people if they do kind of racial profiling, even if it's for some reason, some motive. Like the law generally doesn't give an excuse to an employer who engages in statistical discrimination, right? Saying, well, I'm just not going to hire anyone from this group because there's on average a higher crime rate or higher, whatever. That's generally not allowed. So legally, it's not clear that's kind of an answer, but maybe it's at least sort of understandable or more rational than other forms of discrimination. Sometimes there's sort of a futility argument, right? If it's like what's really going on are these other things that are objectively about the neighborhood, objectively issues about the neighborhood, then if you keep people from searching based on race, and they'll search on these other factors, and if it's really all the same thing, you'll get the same result. Well, it doesn't appear that it's really all the same thing. Again, it's very hard to break this stuff apart, but it looks like at least some of it is sort of path dependent and a function of people continuing to use race as a proxy, and that it's not accurate on these dimensions. Then there's a question of what I call superfluity, if I'm saying that right. If we think that the proxy is not accurate, right? If we think that people are using this proxy and it's not really a very good proxy, then we might say, well, we have very little to worry about. Look how good information technology is getting. Soon people will be able to, rely on whatever is the correct information, and they'll have better apps and better information, and the problem will go away, and you won't have to worry anymore. Well, I'm concerned there too. I'm concerned because there's a lot of reason to think, both kind of theoretically and looking at studies that have been done on things along these lines, that when people are coordinating actions, when it matters sort of what everyone does, you're more likely to stick with some kind of a proxy, even if it's inaccurate, if it's the one that everyone else is using. And this matters a lot in the homeownership context, because housing prices are dependent on what everyone else thinks, on how everyone else rates the house. So this all goes back to John Maynard Keynes, who had this idea of a beauty contest, right? When you're trying to pick stocks or whatever. It's not about what's actually objectively the best. It's what everyone else is going to think is the best. And if you know that everyone else is using a certain proxy, then you're going to want to use that proxy too, because that's what's going to be the winner for you. Okay. So what actually happens with search? Well, I found this particular website fairly recently. I was looking around at different tools. This is called zipwho.com. The most fun you can legally have with zip codes. Kind of interesting catchphrase there. And they actually have a lot of drop-down menus. And I'm just showing you the one that has race in it, but there's other things. They have a lot of different things you can sort on. But they allow you to go and look in a given area, and you can sort based on maximum and minimum. You can put between blank and blank percent. So these kind of data tools exist out there. The question is, is this something that becomes focal? Is this something that reinforces, or, to what extent should we think of this as an interesting development, something that might be legally, that we'd want to do something about, et cetera. There's also lots of other apps. Bill Fisher was just sending me an article from the New York Times recently that had some apps that they were reviewing and talking about. And here's one called Place I Live. match function, which will generate for you your best possible neighborhoods in New York if you fill in a little bit of information about what you want. And how far where you're going to go to work, and how I put it in NYU's address, and how far you want to be from it, and it sort of defaults. The budget it defaults to for buying is between 100,000 and 1 million. You have to like move the slider down. It barely will move if you want to go lower than that. But anyway, it has some other things that you can try to sort on, like what are your priorities? Are you quiet or social, or are you do you value safety or air quality or whatever? So again, there's maybe room for innovation. It's not clear that it's a bad story that there's all this happening. And then there's one that I sort of invented, but there's things that are similar that exist that I called TiVo to go, this is the phonetic pronunciation of TiVo from the TiVo model. And the idea is, let's say you're moving to a new community, and you just want to have exactly what you had before. Like, I was happy, I want what I had before. And so you want something that will match exactly what you had before, and so you have something like this. Well, is this great? Is this like a useful tool? Maybe it's really good at predicting what you will want based on what you liked before. Well, as people have noted in talking about algorithms, generally we worry a lot. We start to worry quite a bit about algorithms that rely on past information. If the past information was somehow tainted with segregation or tainted with some kind of past discrimination, it might be, we just entrench that more when we have natural movement and people are able to replicate it. There certainly have been some things that are sort of designed along these lines. Okay, so I wanted to shift briefly in the last few minutes here to talk a little bit about the law and about questions of whether it's too invasive of someone's autonomy for the law to become involved in where they search for housing. Well, first of all, to sort of start with the basic premise, there's certainly no, legally recognized at least, autonomy-based right to choose the racial composition of your neighbors. Okay, so we know that that's the case. It's been the case at least since 1948. You can't sort of band together as neighbors and block people from moving in based on their race. If you can't choose who your neighbors are that way, is there something different about an autonomy concern about choosing your neighbors based on their race when you're moving in to the neighborhood? Well, it's not clear. It's not clear to me that there is. There may, however, be some other things about your choice of a home that would be extremely hard for any regulator to kind of disaggregate, and it might be too intrusive and really problematically sort of entangling and invasive of privacy to try to untangle why you chose a particular property. Okay, so are you going to have something where you have government agents questioning you about why is it that you need the extra bedroom, or why is it that you need to have this bathroom down the hall from And so nobody wants to have that kind of scrutiny. But the move I make in this paper is to say that having kind of ultimate decisional autonomy about where you're going to live is completely compatible, with a system in which you are not allowed to make race-based choices, explicitly race-based choices about who to buy from, and where there are restrictions on search protocols, the way you go about searching, where, for example, you are not categorically advertising that you're looking for a situation that you're looking to move into a particular area that has a particular racial composition, or where you're not using apps that are kind of categorically ruling out alternatives, or giving instructions to realtors that suggest that you want to only see places that meet particular racial criteria. So you can certainly have these kinds of search protocols that if you follow them, we will then assume that your ultimate decision is your own decision. But there are certain ways in which the law might have a stake in saying, well, we want certain practices of search to become focal and not others, and there are other settings in which we have this similar kind of approach. Okay, so let me do a quick little this is a little conceptualization of rights and duties. That will be familiar to maybe, I'm not sure any of you, but Hopefeld is a legal scholar who talked a lot about rights and duties being correlatives of each other. Okay, why am I mentioning this? Well, if we want people to have a right to fair housing, if we think that it's important that where you live not be a function of the color of your skin, right? If we think that that's important, that's an important normative commitment, that sort of you know, what your choices are in housing are not constrained by protected status, then somebody out there has to have a duty to not discriminate against you along a lot of different dimensions. And because it's sort of a little hard to see, I have a little cross-hatching here to show there are many duty holders, right? And there's also many right holders. But for any individual person to be able to live in a world where they have free housing choice, lots of people out there have to do things like not discriminate against them. And to the extent that we take away, these are sort of the same shape because they sort of match. To the extent that we punch holes in duty holders and we say certain people actually don't have a duty to not discriminate, like home seekers, and then it means that something else in the system has to give, right? It means that either there has to be less rights that are actually realized, or something else in the system has to happen, maybe through something like affirmative for housing, like doing something to compensate for what has happened with respect to the diminution in duties. And so I would suggest, just to stick with this, and I promise I'll make the shapes go away soon, but to stick with this for just a second more, if we think about anti-discrimination law as having kind of this broad conception of rights, ending what Noah's Act is called status causation, which is just what I was saying before, that sort of these important life domains, what you get should not be determined based on protected status. If that's sort of what we hold out and say we're giving you, right? But then we may have this conception of duties that is based on, well, okay, we're only going to put a duty on you if you happen to be in a position that we can reach you now. You know, you're still around, you're a direct perpetrator, you're a particular type of duty bearer, right? And we put these things together, there's kind of a gap. This is not to scale necessarily, but you get the idea. And part of that gap, there's a large gap there between the rights and duties. Part of what I'm saying, you might have to do a search. Okay, so that's sort of conceptually where I'm going, saying let's think about how we might fill in some of the rights that people have by having a little bit more on the duty search side. Okay, so I will just very quickly say a little bit about the law, and I'm glad to talk more about this in Q&A, but I want to make sure we have lots of room for questions. A couple of doctrinal moves that I make in the paper in terms of where can the law step in. Well, I suggest that there actually can be direct liability for certain kinds of discriminatory actions under the Civil Rights Act of 1866. It's a sort of little-known tool in the weapon in the arsenal of civil rights, I guess, that is very broadly worded, doesn't have any exceptions to it, unlike the Fair Housing Act. And this is it in full. And as you can see, it says, all citizens of the United States shall have the same right in every state and territory as is enjoyed by white citizens thereof to inherit, purchase, sell, lease, hold, and convey real and personal property. Notice that it doesn't just say purchase, it also says sell, right? So this suggests actually maybe both sides of the transaction could be subject to some kind of liability. It hasn't really been used in this way, but it at least provides sort of a possibility of this. Okay, when at least in instances where it's very express and it's clear, this law does seem to require intentional discrimination, not just disparate impact, but it's at least a hook. And moreover, it's a hook that makes it easier to say that we should maybe be able to reach some collateral conduct, things like making people liable for discriminatory ads, even when they're the one looking for a place to live. In the same way that we have liability under the Fair Housing Act for other things that maybe we allow the person to make an ultimate decision about, but we still control the search process. Okay, so I compare the so-called Mrs. Murphy exception. This is kind of famous, puzzling exception in the Fair Housing Act, where if you're a so-called Mrs. Murphy landlord, meaning that you live in a building that has 4 or fewer independent dwelling units, and you're living in one of them yourself, that you are not bound by the Fair Housing Act, by its substantive provisions about not discriminating, but you still are bound by its prohibitions against placing discriminatory ads. Okay, so a lot of people kind of wonder about this, right? It means that if somebody Mrs. Murphy is like really discriminatory, and she is not allowed to put an ad, then it means that people might come and look at her place, and then she'll just look at them and she'll say, go away. And she's not liable for anything under the Fair Housing Act anyway. They maybe wasted half a day to come there or whatever. So it's sort of problematic, but the justification, at least one justification for it is, well, at least we're making her interact with people one-on-one. And so we might say something in the search domain. Let's at least have it be that you can't kind of categorically rule people out. The other two things on here are about ways that, to the extent we don't reach people who are actually the searchers, the home seekers with liability, we might want to do other things to, kind of in the search domain by using disparate impact potentially to try to look at ways that policies interact with the choices that people are making, right? So you could have local governments choosing where they're putting housing stock and doing other things in ways that interact with what home seekers are choosing. And then of course we have affirmatively furthering, which opens up, at least potentially, the ability to do a lot of innovation in the search space. If we're now taking a data-driven approach where our goal is to try to diminish segregation and kind of get rid of entrenched segregation and look at ways that we can gain traction on that problem, then there may be ways we can try to innovate, both by different information strategies, through other ways that we can look at how search can contribute to breaking down patterns. And it also suggests, one of the interesting findings in looking at how home seekers make decisions is that homeowners are a lot more sensitive than renters to racial composition. And so one thing that we might think about is kind of changing the stakes that people have in their homes in various ways, and I'll be glad to talk more about that too. Just one quick last slide along those lines is a new site, I don't know if it's going to really catch on, called Realster, where it has a try before you buy program. So we know that people are more sensitive to racial composition when they're moving in than when they're moving out. Part of the reason at least might be that once they have experience with the neighborhood, they don't use race as a way of making a decision as much. Well, maybe if we have try before you buy, maybe get people interested in a low stakes way in the neighborhood, that might be something worth trying out. And we're generally looking at ways to try to introduce a little bit more randomization, a little bit more maybe disturbance in what people's established patterns would be for making decisions about where to choose to live. I will stop there.
Thank you, Lee. We're going to have a few comments from Bill for the next 10 minutes or so, and then we'll have questions.
One for yourself. Okay, I'll try to keep it 10 minutes.
We will want this mic.
I actually project pretty well, but...
I know, I thought I did too. I thought it was so loud, but I guess not.
Can you hear me now? Okay, got you back there. So I'm Bill Fishel. I write about zoning and of course housing. And I was very eager to participate in this, partly because it was a paper by Fennell, who is always interesting, always willing to grasp things that other legal scholars or any scholars are kind of shy about. And so I found this terribly interesting idea of let's try and shift the responsibility for promoting integration to not just the sellers of property or the landlords, but to people who might actually be searching for housing. So this is a brand new territory. I think almost brand new territory, and Lee's wrapped around this very well. In favor of her exposure story of the temporary exposure, this just occurred to me. I give you an analogy of the New Hampshire House of Representatives, which is the largest body, deliberative body, elected body in the Western Hemisphere. House of Commons is a little larger. The thing I found fascinating about them was that New Hampshire was, as a result of our legislature, the first legislature to adopt gay marriage, well before the Supreme Court, without any prompting from its court. Its Supreme Court said, "Not our business. You guys go ahead." And I thought, this is a pretty conservative place. What happened with this? And then I remembered somebody telling me when I visited the legislature, some land use issue that I was talking to people about, that somebody remarked to me that with 400 people, you're bound to have some gay guys. And this was long ago, 20, 30 years ago, and it was discovered by other members. They weren't really out, but it was known, and other people in the legislature who came with anti-gay prejudices found that, hey, these people are pretty much like you and me, and they became just part of the legislature, other people you'd work with. And I think it became very hard for people to get up and give speeches against gay rights and things like this when there's Joe over there who is a gay guy, and it's just hard to do that. And so the legislature eventually came around to, they had lots of gay rights legislation, and they were the first in the nation to say we should adopt gay marriage, and so I think they did proud of that, but I think that also supports this idea of exposure. Exposure helps. The point I want to make here, beyond that, is to ask sort of a paradox, which I've been wrestling with, which is there seem to be signs in the United States that blacks and whites, or white attitudes towards blacks at least, are getting better. There's some desire for more integration. Let's take, I did n-gram searches. If you know, I don't have time to show you what an n-gram is, but Google n-gram and you can put in all-white suburb. Back in the day, all-white suburb did not have any pejorative connotation. Nowadays it does. Almost all references to all-white suburbs are pejorative. So I take that as a sign. Colleges and universities want diversity, even at the and students, and they want them for value maximizing reasons. The students who apply to them want diverse populations. Of course, white students would like, I'd like to get in, don't discriminate, but they want the overall policy. The success of some suburbs, like Oak Park, Shaker Heights, and Montclair, Oak Park, Illinois, Shaker Heights, Ohio, and Montclair, New Jersey, in deliberately promoting themselves as integrated suburbs is a positive sign. And right here in Massachusetts, I will take the failure to repeal 40B. I probably don't have to explain what 40B is here. the open housing, the zoning override for low-income housing. This wasn't about race per se, but back in 2010, I noticed that there was an initiative on the ballot to repeal this open housing, this promoting of open housing in the suburbs. Suburbs had very much resisted this, and I thought, well, most of the people live in the suburbs here, 40B is gone. The repeal measure failed by 58%. Nick Morantz, who was a student here, sent me a chart about it, and indeed, the people most in favor of repealing 40B were indeed in the suburbs, but still failed. Indeed, most suburbs voted against repeal. So there's some affirmative belief here, even if every 40B project runs into resistance because it's next to me, there's a general feeling that this is a good idea, that we shouldn't just toss this story out. And I guess I don't have to report that we've not only had a African-American president, we've re-elected him, and so things ought to be looking better. Why then do we see so much of this, or do we see so little progress, I should say, on the integrated, further affirmative integrated housing? Why is this so problematic? One answer I would give, and Lee actually alluded to this, so you can ask both of us about this story, is that this is the one place where I wish I had a slide, so I'm just going to use my finger. Okay, here is time. Here is like 1950, and here is about now. and I will put up the Case-Shiller index of housing prices. Housing prices from about 1950, post-war, go gradually down. And then they start going up, down, up again, down, up in the last. Housing, back in the 1950s and early 1960s, housing was regarded as a nice thing to own, so you didn't have to rent and pay the rent, and you acquire some equity, and you'd be pride of ownership. But nobody thought that you'd send your kids to college based on your home value. Nobody thought you could take trips to Hawaii with a home equity loan. Nobody thought that it would pay for your retirement and health care and things like that. After 1970, housing became regarded as a growth stock. And that's when people started to think of, this is an asset I gotta protect. So I think what's happening here is that people are in fact becoming more socially, white people are becoming more socially responsive and responsible to the larger community norms and the norms of an integrated society. I think are much more widely resonating. But you've got this very large asset that you own. You don't just want to protect its value, you want to protect its trajectory of growth. And so you can't just have Oak Park Insurance, a very fascinating thing, by the way. If you look it up, Oak Park, Illinois, and their housing value insurance. You can't do that because you can't just insure its value. Now you got to insure its value in 30 years or 20 years. And people become crazy about that. People become semi-irrational in the things they will do. I was chair of the zoning board in the farthest suburb of Boston, Hanover, New Hampshire. And believe me, people are fussy about this. I mean, they would never say it because of low-income housing or something like that. But when you make these proposals to have infill development with smart growth, it does not fly. It just is very, very hard to do this. And so I think one of the margins that we think we need to work on, I think Lee's margins are interesting to work with. They have some problems here. Whether they will penalize, whether the search process where we want to monitor the search process will penalize people who want to move into integrated neighborhoods will require some very, very difficult, very tricky calculation. But I think the other margin we need to work in is to calm down the housing market. And the way we can calm down the housing market is make it less of a tax darling. Get rid of or at least limit the mortgage deduction. Have some reasonable cap on capital gains that would affect the middle class. And that might calm people down so that more sensible ways of promoting fair housing can be contemplated by people of goodwill who nonetheless are overly worried about the value of their house. Thank you very much.
Great. We'd love to have questions from anyone who has questions. David.
Can you all hear me?
No, it's all right.
Yeah, it's all right.
Yeah.
All right.
Should we share this?
So thank you. So, is this on?
Yeah.
It's on? Yeah? I'm not sure. That's better, right?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. So great paper, Lee. Thank you from both of you for making the trip. And I guess I want to, I think it's a fascinating idea that the law can sort of reach these home seekers, but I wonder whether, I mean, in some sense, the first part of the paper is very provocative, saying that the law can reach there. Your policy suggestions are actually a little softer. And I wonder whether there's sort of one alternative that I might read your paper and sort of think about. Maybe there's a weaker claim that we can make, that we don't actually necessarily want anything, to make anything illegal, but it might just not be tenable to say we're going to actually, you said at one point we would make it illegal for somebody to make a choice exclusively based on race, on the racial composition of the neighborhood, right? It's hard to imagine that we would really ever be able to monitor that, but it still might be that we want to enact policies. And this is, I guess, the question is sort of this difference between law and policy. Policies, right, that encourage the kind of moves that we think would encourage integration. And you know, one way to do that, I mean, there are all sorts of nudges that we could adopt, right? And we could adopt one thing you don't talk about is sort of subsidies, right? We've had examples of some places, Shaker Heights, one of them, and the state of Ohio actually considered enacting a mortgage subsidy program that would actually essentially incentivize pro-integrative moves. So it would give people access to lower interest mortgages when they were willing to move into a neighborhood that was, so it's basically like a Pigouvian tax, saying that there's an externality, right? That's the problem. It's not like we're not going to ban this, but let's tax it, right? That's what we do when we have behavior. It's sort of a libertarian paternalist approach, right? We might think that people shouldn't drink, you know, big soda cups, whatever. We don't make that illegal necessarily, but maybe we want to tax it. And so I guess that's my question for you, sort of moving towards in that direction rather, or do you really want to make the stronger claim that actually there's some things we want to make legal? I mean, maybe, you know, post photos on Airbnb, right? That might be one.
Use that one. Use that one.
I don't use that one, that's true.
Okay, yeah. Thanks so much, Ingrid. Yeah, so I guess what I'm hoping to do in the paper is to open up the idea that search is something that we should be concerned with. And I do think that there's multiple ways to try to get at it, definitely. So part of what I'm doing is trying to inventory the legal tools that are there. What could be possible ways of having causes of action? Is it so crazy that we could say discrimination against a seller, you know, if you're doing it based on race? I mean, I think that's often going to be impossible to prove, but in cases where there's really good evidence and they say that that's why, you know, it's not clear to me that that's a normative problem. Will it be our best tool? No, because there's going to be very few instances like that. In fact, one of the things I'm hoping to put more content about in the paper is the idea of developing norms around search, so that, you know, part of it is the sort of choice architecture that you talk about, like setting up things so that it's easier for people to make the choices, or at least they're nudged in that direction. But it could also be the case that it becomes kind of like, let's suppose that, just use your Airbnb example, suppose that they still had photos, but you had to make like a separate choice to see it. And it became like kind of a icky thing for people. You know, people didn't really, they just felt better. The norm what developed was you don't want to gain information that you don't want to make a decision on, even unconsciously. I mean, you could certainly have things like that where you're not depriving people of information that they need, but you're having a norm that suggests, look, there's a better way. Now, subsidies are really interesting, and my concern there, maybe I should be more aggressive in thinking about this. It's hard to think about how to design them in a way that wouldn't be a race-based remedy, because it would be like, well, you are eligible for this subsidy because you're moving into this neighborhood, you know. So it starts to edge a little closer to what I think might be a concern of the Supreme Court about race-based remedies, but I'm not sure. But absolutely, I mean, the goal is really to think about ways to open the door to reaching this domain. And so it's not, ultimately it's not at all about saying that people can't choose where to live. It's like, let's look at the margins where we've done things in the past where, you know, it used to be thought, well, everyone has a free right to dispose of their home to whoever they want and not to whoever they want. And we sort of changed that through the law. And I think that there's other dimensions where if we were to change it, it wouldn't really be a serious imposition on autonomy, and it might have symbolic force and be something that would then help to support policies. But I think having affirmative further available as kind of a way of pushing communities to look at creatively. I'm all about trying to think about ways to use carrots as well as sticks, and not at all about trying to tell people like, oh, you know, absolutely we're forbidding you to go here, or something like that. It's really more about trying to engineer, you know, trying to set up a system where the sort of shifted in a direction that's made a little bit more friendly to immigration, rather than having all the kind of inertial weight on the side of entrenching the way that things are.
Other questions?
I'll just do this without the mic. I'm John Spader from the Midwest Center for Housing Studies. So the way that you framed the paper is around the search process, which is really about how you choose your next home. It seems like implicit in that are actually two decisions. One's the decision to leave. The second is the decision about which home I choose next. And so that decision about which home I choose next is directly relevant to things like what neighborhood characteristics Redfin might include. I'm curious about are you intentionally excluding the decision to leave? Because it seems like marketing practices or like the algorithms Google uses to determine who receives which ads and find out which information might influence that decision to leave. So can you just comment on sort of, does that fit within, or are you intentionally excluding it, or is that within the framework?
So I'm not at all meaning to intentionally exclude anything from people's consideration. The paper is making search its focus because it hasn't received attention, but you're absolutely right that it's linked together with the exit decision. My sense is that the decision about where to move is very often the more kind of dominant, more sensitive one to racial composition. And it's also the case that if someone is leaving a place, right, if they're leaving for racial reasons, which again I think has been ebbing in general, there may be some places where it still occurs. If they're leaving for racial reasons and not just for some other reason, then it seems as if they're never going to do that unless they're also engaging in a search process that will bring them into a neighborhood that meets whatever criteria they have. So I see it as being paired with it, and to the extent that search is a dimension that we can reach, I think it would help to also dampen down the leaving decision. Now, of course, a lot of times in sort of when white flight was happening more prevalently, a lot of what was happening was this sort of waves of panic about home values, right? And so people might not be leaving for their own racial reasons at all, but they might be thinking, well, I think the house might become less valuable in the future, or something like that, if other people have this reaction. And there, it is a lot about in-movers too. You sort of think about the search process. It's like, well, I'm concerned that the people who might buy my house in the future won't want my house in the future because I'm making some assumptions about the way that they're going to undertake search. So I think that getting it searched does, in a lot of ways, interact with that decision. I'm kind of cordoning off a lot of other things that clearly contribute to segregation as well as search does, but trying to bring in something that I think is a piece of it that hasn't been looked at so far.
I occasionally read these articles about how to be a good gentrifier,
Yes.
sorts of things. And I'm really interested in kind of what the Schelling model tells us about that, you know, you can have all the best preferences in the world and be perfectly happy in an integrated neighborhood, but if you make that integrated neighborhood a little bit wider, you're pushing it a little bit more towards the tipping point of the Schelling model.
Yes.
And so I'm curious, when you talk about regulating individual preferences, but you're in a scenario where you get emergent aggregate effects that are bad, even though individual preferences can be good, where does the legality come into effect there?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And so part of my thinking on gentrification, at least on gentrification that takes I don't think this is the form that it tends to take empirically most prevalently, but to the extent that we're thinking of gentrification in the stereotypical way that it's like mass displacement and rapid racial change, to the extent that there's something like that happens, I think it is driven by exactly what you're saying, where it's sort of like a reverse white flight kind of idea that as the racial picture changes, that it becomes more attractive. Now there is this kind of question about sort of who's getting attracted. There could be a story where everybody's getting attracted to the neighborhood kind of simultaneously. They all want the very diversity that they are now making impossible by their presence. And so there is kind of this question of whether you could have something, I'm very intrigued by this idea, some kind of a way of people coordinating their actions and coordinating their search and you know, sort of choosing to, as you could sort of have online coordination that would be sensitive to this. Now again, it starts to walk a line closer to sort of race-conscious decision-making in another way to be able to look at making integrated decisions. But it's interesting to me because we know that the sort of individual decisions can kind of aggregate sometimes to create a result that people don't individually or collectively really want. So I'm intrigued by ways that communities might be able to do things that would nudge in the direction of being able to maintain, maintaining integration that may be attractive to people. Now, that said, I think that sometimes sometimes gentrification doesn't necessarily take the form of creating a lot of rapid racial change or a lot of displacement. So there's been a lot of empirical studies about kind of like what form does it take, and when is it harmful in particular ways. But yeah, I think there could be room for coordinating. It's also kind of interesting to me, whether there's something about the way that the sort of community amenities or other things about the community that can kind of change the way that it's attractive to people or something like that. I mean, you want to make an area be attractive to. You want to make an area be attractive in a way that isn't going to create this kind of herding response that's going to then undo the gains, to make it the victim of its own success in a sense.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. This is a fascinating perspective to have. I'm a transportation planner. You mentioned the example of Uber. I'd like to get your view on this because you can imagine that always say if a driver to discriminate the passenger, that's clearly illegal. It seems most will agree. On the other side, for the passenger to choose driver, also you can think of it's pretty straightforward. We may not allow it. So my question is then, why in the Uber context the question seems clearer that for the passenger to choose the driver, to reject driver based on races? I think most people agree it's clearly wrong. While in the housing context, it's not as so obvious. You have to write a paper to make people look at this. So what's the difference between the two markets? I try to.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure it's so clear in the Uber example. And there is another paper that someone else wrote that talks about that in part. So yeah, it's not at all clear because it would be the customer's decision. So
when you hire Uber, you don't buy the car.
Right.
There's a difference here.
Right. So I don't know. I think this is just an area that hasn't been looked at in a lot of detail. And I think that there are settings where, I think with respect to housing, there is this kind of overlapping consensus that developed based on the idea that it's extremely difficult to police it. And sort of a sense that the law can't realistically reach it, and also that it probably isn't doing that much harm. And I think all these things are like changing a bit. It may be that things are becoming at least marginally easier to enforce, at least in certain ways, to the extent that people are relying on data tools, and there may also be just some opportunities that come up for being able to shape things more clearly. But I think the whole realm of customer discrimination is kind of fascinating. It's an emerging legal area, something that people are starting to look at more and more.
Amy, did you have a question?
As a non-houser, please excuse me for asking a very simple question, but is there some type of multiplicative relationship between multi-unit rental housing and single-owner housing and the tendency for the processes you're describing to actually unfold? Because I'm just thinking in terms of, if you have a 12-unit building and you can have 12 separate families and then you have a lot of single-family housing, how do those two interact as influences?
Yeah, so I mean, it's a good question. To what extent? I mean, I certainly have the impression that homeowners are much more sensitive to racial composition than renters. I don't know.
Is her example a multi-unit
A
place
condo?
where they're owned?
Right, it can be a condo.
Or rented?
Well, actually, it's really not even specifying that. I just was trying to wonder whether or not there are features of either the item, the structure, or it's the number and how that changes the character of the place that influences people's behavior.
Right.
Are people more likely to feel comfortable moving into a place that is multi-unit and diverse or not relative to single-family homes? Do they think that their value is preserved in one versus another in a different way.
Right, so let's compare condo owners to homeowners, and so it's just that the physical structure is different. So the question is whether something about the interaction or the structure would make a difference. I don't know of any research on that question, comparing homeowners with condo owners, right?
There's a paper I remember from about 10 years ago by a colleague of mine, Bruce Sasserdote, who looked at the asset, and Ed Glazer, and I can't remember what they came up with, actually.
Okay,
but there was some difference. It got published, okay? If it was all the same, it got published.
It's not exactly on this.
No, I don't think one
But
exactly.
it's a great question.
But if I wanted to find the answer to that, I would look at a follow-up on, I would do the Google Scholar
Right.
citations on
Yeah.
that paper.
Certainly cooperatives are a bit infamous on that front.
Of course, right. But of course, the cooperatives have this separate thing of everybody's on the same mortgage, and they're so financially entwined that gives them sort of one reason for being picky, although certainly there's lots of evidence that
There are some studies that people have hypothesized that density makes a difference, that people are more comfortable. And one of the reasons maybe we see more racial integration on sort of the western part of the country is the fact that it's sort of lower density living, and people are more comfortable living with neighbors when their neighbors are actually, a quarter mile away than they are next door, like my neighbor is, right? I mean, you're literally going to be bumping into people more and sharing walls in a multifamily unit. So,
Yeah,
but then again, on the
common
public
areas,
service side,
right.
you still may be in the same school system. So
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question.
people have speculated, but I don't think there's any really good research on it.
We're almost out of time, but maybe we could just take the last two questions at the same time. Larry and
Like at exactly the same time they're going to speak?
they're going to, without getting the answer.
So the short version of my question is whether we're talking about 1866 or 1968, the model of black-white segregation, has that been superseded by the complexity of discriminatory practices in a country that has lots of groups and even intra-black or intra-white or other kinds of practices?
And can we take the other question?
Oh yeah, my question was actually going to be more explicitly about different kinds of search mechanisms with dependence by tenure, so rental versus ownership, and also thinking historically about case studies of persistently integrated neighborhoods, whether that kind of historical research exists. Just like thinking quickly, it does seem that diversity of tenure as well as diversity of density might make a difference, as well as obviously subsidy programs and rent stabilization, that kind of thing. But how that plays in, it seems like the examples you raised of integrated neighborhoods today are kind of predominantly suburban, where there was some kind of policies put in place to enforce integration. I'm talking more about the passive maybe integration.
Right. Yeah, no, it's a really interesting question. I mean, one thing that diversity of tenure might get you is more turnover in some areas. So turnover is very interesting to me, like kind of how often are people moving in and moving out, because for whatever reason, whenever you have, it's sort of like a slider puzzle, whenever there's spaces, you have more room for there to be change. And so I'm not sure. So Oak Park is, of course, one example of a community in Illinois, a Chicago suburb that's been very actively involved for many decades in integration and maintenance. The neighborhood that I live in, Beverly, has had also a history that not sort of currently doing as much, but sort of a history of trying to manage integration. And I think largely those are. I think Beverly is largely homeowners, but Oak Park, I believe, is a mix, and they have a regional housing center that is explicitly targeted at renters where they move in, and trying to sort of give guidance, and they do affirmative marketing kind of stuff to try to counter-steer, in a sense, from what people have maybe been led to think is the part of Oak Park that they would be most interested in. So,
and there may be a whole panel on that coming up.
sorry.
We're talking about that.
Oh, okay. Well, good. Okay, but as let me jump to the other question. You're absolutely right. In this paper, I focus on black-white discrimination and segregation, and I don't at all engage sort of the full diversity that is out there. That's extremely important. I do think that in defense of that choice, I do think that it has proven to be the most intractable and the most damaging. form of segregation. And so sort of looking at, it's the place where the attitudes seem to be the strongest. So looking at that, I think, suggests that if we can come up with tools that work there, I would have confidence about them working in other settings. But it's absolutely right that when we think about policies, we sort of have to think about how they might play in other contexts when we're talking about other groups as well.
Everyone could join me in thanking Lee and Joe. And hopefully we'll see you all again on Friday and next Tuesday. Something I've written on.
Yeah, I'm